Hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining us as we continue this conversation about fighting racism. We began this conversation actually in the fall and said we wanted to get back to it, and life got crazy, and we got connected back together. This is Shawn Newell, everybody, who joined us in our last dialogue, and we're super excited to continue this conversation. Just real quick again, Shawn is the director of the Utah Multicultural Civic Council. He's also the vice president of Industrial Supply Company, and we were just having the most important conversation as he used to play football for the University of Utah. Shawn, thanks so much for joining us again.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So, man, how you doing? How you holding up here? You just before we dive into things with COVID as the numbers are coming down?
I tell you what, I'm getting excited about being able to get with people and gather again. I'm an introvert, but I still enjoy my time, being in fellowship with people and just sharing space.
Yeah, me too, buddy.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you everybody for joining us. We basically, as Shawn and I were talking, we're going to hit two main topics today. The first one is just going to be the fact that we just finished actually Black History Month, and so we're going to talk about Black history. And then the second thing we want to talk about is how important it is that we're actually having this conversation and dialoguing on this topic now instead of waiting until the next crisis hits. So those are the two things where we're really going to tackle today. So Shawn, I know that when you and I just really getting to know each other began this conversation, you said to me very emphatically, part of what needs to happen, Dave, is people need to understand history. They need to. We could do better today if we actually knew the history. So, bring it on, man. Help us to understand.
That's really critical. If we don't know where we've come from, we can never evaluate where we are and where we need to go. And studying history has been uncomfortable, especially when we talk about race and the considerations behind the issues we're having with race today. We talk about the history of slavery in this country. We talk about even before slavery, when people were claiming, discovering this country that was already inhabited by people that were indigenous to this space.
Yeah.
So when we talk about history, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable for some reason, and we need to get over that. If we're going to be able to understand each other better about who we are, where we come from, we have to hear everybody's history and know how they all intersect as the histories collaboratively expressed and explained about where people are and how we've developed as cultures.
Yeah. So, and you grew up in California.
Yep.
And you've been in Utah for how long?
About 40 years.
About 40 years.
Yeah.
So, in your experience, both as a student learning history in California and watching it here, what are some of the key things that you just feel like are not being addressed at the level they should be?
Well, one of the biggest things is the realities of our history. We teach our history in a way that's palatable for the larger majority of citizens in our country. We didn't teach an awful lot of Black history. When we talk about Black history, everybody says, well, there's a month when we really focus on Black history. We still don't allow for our young people especially to be able to dive deep into what all is entailed in that history, because there are some painful things to be discussed. There's some painful experiences throughout our history, but without them knowing that as young people, how are they going to develop into being able to have a greater understanding and empathy for those that have had those experiences? Me, for example, I went through busing to desegregate our school system in Southern California. People think, well, that's only down south. No, this was all over the country. And I was bused to a majority white school. And I had to go to school and try to assimilate. But then I had to come back to my neighborhood where there were students that weren't part of the districting that I was part of, that lived a block behind me. And there was conflict there too, because they felt that I was getting something above and beyond what they were getting. So there's all these different issues in our history that people have to consider, and it's great for them to learn that these things existed, and also to talk to people that have come through these types of incidents and types of environments as our history started to develop.
Yeah. So it's interesting to hear you say that we usually teach history in a way that's comfortable for the majority.
Yes.
I'm from Michigan originally. My sisters moved to Mississippi. And I remember my sister telling me, wow, the history my kids are learning here about American history is way different than what we learned up in Michigan. Have you noticed that? Like that, again, how history, even as it's taught around the nation, is unique and different based on the majority.
Very different. And it comes from just that foundation of people understanding and being part of their environment, knowing what they should share and what is important for them to share about their histories. You know, you go down south and it's a little more, I would say, illuminating to see that there are still signs where you can recognize the Jim Crow era. And people talk about that in the history down there because it was a part of the fracturing of the Confederate. You know, when it was part of our history in this country. You get further north and people don't want to talk about that as much. They want to talk about things that are more modern, the industrialization of our country and how people were integrated. So they thought were being integrated into systems. But if you look at the systemic history of our country, you start to see where there's a lot more than overlap.
Yeah.
There is actually the same types of things going on in a different way, depending on where you move around the country.
Yeah. So take us to some of those. So take it to us to some of the key things that we're dealing with today because they took place in our history.
Great. Well, I'm not a complete subject matter expert, but I get a kick out of studying these things for not only myself,
by the way,
but to share.
You're on the State Board of Education, right?
Yeah, the State Board of Higher Education.
Of Higher Education.
Yes.
Okay.
So for all of our higher education institutions, which there are 16 of them here in the state of Utah.
Okay.
So when we look at history and the intersections of how history works, we saw that there were the sharecroppings situations there in the southern part of the country. As especially blacks moved north, they ran into the beginning of the industrialization of this country. And there was the exclusion there. There were other ethnic groups that were moving into the country that were more acceptable to be workers. For example, the Irish and some of the people from Germany and Europeans that were able to go into work into the automobile plants, the steel plants, and those type of industries. But when the war hit, it shifted things a little bit, the First World War, when women had to start moving into the workplace and when they had to start giving, people that were minoritized some of these positions. But that didn't last very long because once the wars ended, World War I and World War II, they started to replace all of these individuals in certain ways that were not conducive to being humanistic. So help me here then. Yeah.
Civil War's over, all the way till World War I in the North.
Yes.
You're saying that it was still really difficult for the black population to get work.
Still very difficult. They were still slave hunters after the Civil War that were going north, finding slaves that had gained their freedom in the South, recapturing them and bringing back to owners down in the south part of our country. Yeah. The biggest thing that drove all of this was the economy of the South. And the economy of the South ran this country during the times of slavery. I did some research and I found that if we just took the southern states back there during the time of slavery, it would have been the 5th largest economy in the world.
Just the southern states?
Just the southern states, because of cotton and sugarcane and a few of the other smaller industries. That was the biggest driver for slavery. That was one of the things that was really terrifying to those in the South that owned slaves and plantations and property, in that they would lose their entire economy if slaves were freed. And here we go to the big battle, right? Yeah. Because now the people in the North are saying, wait a minute, we're starting to industrialize. We want to open this up. And there's always this claim that, Lincoln wanted to free the slaves and everything else. His goal was not really to free the slaves, but he did not want the division of this country to take place, which the South was striving for, to separate from the Union.
Okay.
So those are some of the realities we don't talk about in our history when we teach people. It's not about slavery, but that was the most visible thing for people to jump on and to, decide, this is a great cause. It's about people. It's about politics. It's about economics. It's about money, which is a sad thing because what's gobbled up in all that? People.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. Last time we got together, you guys were able to give us some questions, and one of the questions was, why can't we talk about this topic without getting political?
Well, politics plays a big role in this. Politics, all the way from prior to the country being colonized, to reaching back to, in where we are now in Christianity. There were factions that did not want slaves to, especially in the late 1600s, did not want slaves to become Christians, because by law at that time, if you became a Christian, you could sue for your freedom. And hence they went back and they changed the laws so that even if African American slaves became baptized or Christians, they could not sue for their freedom. So there was all these different things that were trying to hold back these factions based on economics, and going back when the country was first started, and all of these rules and laws that they were put in place, they had to shift them. And one of the biggest ways that they shifted a lot of these laws was through the Supreme Court back then. The Supreme Court, at one time, when a lot of negative things started happening in our country, was made up of primarily Supreme Court justices from the South, which really shifted the way that laws were made in this country. And we still see the impact of some of those laws today.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's interesting. Let's go there a little bit, because
I keep taking you to all these places, right?
No, but which is great. But I think that's the question now, is what the implications that we're experiencing today because of some of these decisions. Like, I just know one that's always been so intriguing to me, but the whole redlining issue.
Yes.
So in fact, I think somebody said that is, have black people in Utah experienced practices like redlining when trying to get loans or start businesses? So give us some history on the redlining and the impacts still today.
Yeah, and I'm still learning about Utah's history with redlining, but from what I understand, there was an area on the west side of Salt Lake where the train tracks are located.
Hey, just real quick, will you even define redlining first before, just for everybody?
What redlining is actually setting up districts or points of reference where you can determine the economic factors such as housing and industry and commerce by setting these actual lines and borders to the places you want those, higher impact economic environments to be or not to be. And that's what actually redlining is.
Okay.
And it happens everywhere. It happens everywhere. We see it. It impacts school district lines. It impacts commerce. Just about anything you can imagine. And it separates people. Yep. Yeah. But,
okay, so take it, to today.
So here in Utah, from the history I gathered, there was a lot of because Utah is the crossroads of rail, and because of that crossroads of rail being here, they wanted to make sure that the people, the porters, and everybody that worked for the railroad stayed within a certain area. So below State Street was about that border. It was actually went a little bit further west than State Street was that border. But in talking to some of my Greek and Japanese friends, State Street was the big red line for Utah, and it goes all the way across the Salt Lake Valley. So, people, even Greek people, were not allowed to purchase property east of State Street.
Wow. So
we look at Salt Lake City now, we see the affluent neighborhoods primarily east of State Street, except it's kind of changed a little bit. You've got the West Jordan areas and the South Jordans, and even West Valley now has some very nice areas. But in the beginning, when we were a very small state, this was an area of separation.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. And this is there's still some gaps in my understanding of this, but this is information I've got from people and in doing some of the research that I've had. So the impact you still see in the demographics based on that line. And it's pretty visible when you really take a good look at it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that people need to learn is we can see history if we just take a close look. We have a little bit of foundation by learning about it, reading about it, but you can see it if you take a close look. When you drive down south in Mississippi, you can see it.
Yeah.
And it's difficult for people that don't travel enough in our country to really see the division that we have within our own border. And once you do that, it's really eye-opening. And I think it's a great thing for people to do. Don't be in a hurry to go to Cancun or to go to Hawaii. Take a trip across your own country and learn something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really eye-opening.
Yeah. So, so what would you suggest, like in light of the importance that it is to know history, what are some steps maybe that you're even involved in now to try to help in that way? And what are some suggestions you can give to anybody who's listening today?
One of the biggest steps that we can make in understanding and learning about history is to first take a deep dive into ourselves, learn ourselves better and understand where we're coming from so that we can relinquish any biases that may be barriers to us learning. Once we can relinquish those barriers to us learning, we can actually reach out. We can read. We can go and talk to people that are historians here in our state. We have a lot of history that's in our state, and it's visible and it's available, but we don't do it. We're caught up in that hamster wheel, and we're just moving along thinking everything's great for me. I'm not going to worry about everybody else around me. Take a look at what's going on with the people that live within our state and learn their history. I mean, there's things going on right now like homelessness and people that are deprived of food and nutrition that we have to take a look at and think, where does that happen in our history? You know, it's been a part of our history for a very long time. Why? How does that exist? Does that intersect with politics? You know, those are the things we need to do. But if we take time to learn, take time to read and ask and have the tough conversations, you know, conversations like this where we can learn from each other. And sometimes we question the things that we discuss, but we can go back and try to verify those things in different ways. That's conducive to us growing as people. Because we want to grow in relationship. Guess what? We're all in this together. We're not going anywhere. Yeah. We're all brothers and sisters, and we need to find a way to understand each other. Once we start to get on that pathway to understanding and growing, we're going to see a difference in the way that our world looks, and we're going to impact the future of our history. And that's what we need to do, is take that step back, think about who I am, be willing to go to the uncomfortable places and learn, and then strive to learn more about those that are around us without fear, without apprehension, with authentic curiosity. And then we start to grow. Yeah.
And and that's really true. I have learned, right, if there's somebody that you just feel like, oh, we're too different, or we're staying apart from each other, or we actually know we're different because we have different opinions on certain things. If you actually would sit down and go, hey, tell me your story.
Yeah.
All the way. And if people will be willing, it's amazing how all of a sudden the walls start to come down. Because you actually begin to understand. Because part of it is we can't understand, right? I can't understand. I can't sit here from a distance and understand the life you've lived and the things you've been through.
No. But you're right. If you walk somebody through your life experiences, I will almost guarantee you that there's something that crosses both of your paths the same way.
Yeah.
And the same experience. Yeah. And then you start sharing. Yeah. Once you start sharing those commonalities, then you can work into the hard spaces where I don't understand, you know, what it would be like to be on a bus, being bused to a neighborhood where you're not welcome to go to school. And I can say, I don't understand, you know, living in a neighborhood where you could ride your bike all hours of the night and not worry for your safety. Yeah. You know, and those types of conversations are necessary for us to really get to have a deep dive in understanding one another.
Yeah. So we can hear each other's story, which was really important. But then you're saying, but you also need to know our story, the nation's story. Do you have any suggested readings that come to your top of your head?
I do. I have a whole list. I wish I could have brought the whole list.
You know what? I didn't. I wish I would have thought of that question earlier, but it just hit me. It's like I would love to read something. Do you have just even just one?
Yeah, I'm reading a great book right now called Stamped from the Beginning.
Stamped from the Beginning.
Mm-hmm. I cannot remember the author, but it gives a lot of history, and it builds up to, you know, where we are now and the occurrences that took place in our history that brought us to where we are right now. And it shows those little snippets of why we still have misunderstandings as people. Okay. All along the way in this book. And I've just barely started it. I just read another book. I read all the time, so I'm trying to remember think of which one would be the best one.
Yeah.
But take books that like The Color of Law, to understand the existence of caste systems within our country that have worked to separate people and to put people in certain positions where it makes it difficult for them to be successful.
Yeah.
You know, we talk about redlining. Pick up books on redlining and gentrification of neighborhoods. We see gentrification going on all over the place, and you know what that is? It's when you take a low-income neighborhood, and people that are able to afford to, remodel and rebuild start to slowly move to those neighborhoods because either the propensity for the increase in the value of those properties increases.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that in my politically correct way, but we see it going on in downtown Salt Lake right now. It becomes, the urbanized areas are now becoming what I call an urban residential area. We start to see people moving in. We start to see apartment complexes being built that are not affordable for the people that live within those areas. So they're forced to be pushed out further and further from the areas that are becoming more and more popular.
Yeah.
And the people that can live in those areas are actually gaining some semblance of wealth. And one of our biggest problems in this country is the lack of or minimization of generational wealth amongst our minoritized people in our country, in our ethnic groups. Because of slavery and other things, jobs, the lack of jobs, those type of things, redlining, the opportunity to have generational wealth has been dissipated. And people are still trying to get past that. We still see incidents of loans being denied for people of color. We see people of color being steered away from certain neighborhoods. And these types of things really start to build upon, the negative feelings that people have and the burden that people live with every single day.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you the chance to make a decision here. You shared a story with me that was just crazy.
Yeah.
And so we could either share that story, or we could shift over and talk about why this is an important topic now and not during crisis. What do you want to
I want
hit?
to talk about why it's important now.
Okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
Hit that.
We go through these periods in our history when things are really quiet. We just came out of, or we're hopefully coming out of a pandemic, but for a lot of marginalized communities, it was a dual pandemic. We saw the social unrest and the injustices that took place during 2020. It was very visible because of technology. It allowed us to see things differently. Now imagine being someone within those demographics that were impacted and having this pandemic on top of it, and the burden that you feel, the impact on your livelihood. Because people were losing jobs, and we were losing jobs in the area of, lower wage people for the most part were the most highly impacted. Now they were expected to recover. How are you going to recover from a year and now going past almost over a year of having no income and trying to survive? We did things like the stimulus, but that small stimulus check is not going to help a family of 4 survive for 13, 14, 15 months. So we have to really look at where we are right now. We're in this quiet time. This is a time to build. This is a time to look at ways to be able to shift these narratives, to be able to help and find mechanisms for help so that we don't run into something like this again. We can work on the social unrest that we started to work on during 2020, but got quieted down because now, we don't have that visibility from political disruptions.
Yeah.
We don't have that push with protest and everything else that's really visible. These battles are still going on, trust me, but it's not as visible. It's not made as visible by our media or those in power on purpose, because when it's quiet, it's time to get back to, doing our thing. Yeah. But doing our thing should be taking care of people.
Right. And it is way
right
too easy to slip back into just the normal life. So can you give us any specific ideas then? Because I just sort of, what do we work on? You're like, now's the time to work on. What What do we do? What are some
Now's
things
the
to work?
time. The biggest thing to work on now is gaining a greater understanding of what equity is and what equitable practices are in our communities. When we talk about employment, what is equity? Equity is not diversity. Diversity is not inclusion. These are all separate things that we have to focus on. We talk about equity. That's not giving something to somebody just so they can have it. But what you're doing with equity is you're trying to get people to a point where there's leveling out. None of us start out in the same place. And some of us start out in a negative. So we have to take those folks that are in a negative, give them something that can help them build to where they can be in an equitable place, a better starting point.
So
And
I'm gonna challenge you then. Help me, like, people are watching this, they're listening to this. They work in places. What are some things that people can actually do in their work environments or to make a difference?
yeah, to make a difference, be willing to nurture those around you. Be willing to help people understand the systems they're in. When I talk about equity, some of us didn't grow up with the having discussions in the household about this is the way you work, this is how you fit into a system, and we need to learn that. So if you have that knowledge, share that knowledge with someone that may not have it. They probably will not step up to talk to you about it because systematically they've been told you don't bring those conversations up. Psychologically, you've been told don't show weakness by asking for help. But we need to take people under our wings and say, this is how this system works. And if you do these things within the system, the barriers will come down. But we need to make sure that the system understands that if they do the right things, there should be no barriers to people moving forward. And that is critical. And that comes from leadership.
Yeah.
Leadership has to say, I'm going to create a culture where whoever does the work, whoever shows the enthusiasm, the drive, will get that position. Or they will be allowed into this circle. We need to give people credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
And when you don't, you start to develop these systems where people don't even want to participate anymore.
Can you give an example of something you've been involved in where you've been able to help make this happen and or seen it happen in an effective way?
I mean, in my job, I've seen it happen. My chairman of the board, who was the president of our company at the time, I was working part-time sweeping floors and cleaning bathrooms and doing the warehouse work. And he asked me one day, he says, what do you want to do when you graduate? Because I was in school, but I could only work during times that school's not in session. And I said, well, geez, I see these sales guys driving around in nice cars and they're wearing suits. That's what I want to do. And he said, well, what do you think you have to do for that? I said, well, I'm going to try to graduate first, and then I'm going to figure out how that works. And he said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you work in different parts of this company so you can learn how the company works. So I started from the warehouse. I went to will call. I went to inside sales. I worked in a number of different departments in the warehouse just to get that understanding of how this mechanism worked. And along the way, he would check in and say, how's it going? Do you understand this? Do you need some help? How can I help you? And that wasn't just mentorship. It was called sponsorship. He took me into those spaces where I may not have had those opportunities before.
Wow.
And this is a 105-year-old company, a family-owned business. And he's one of the family members that runs it. But he saw something in me and said, I'm going to give you this opportunity. And I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
He's done it for a number of people that came through our business that said, I want to do something more.
Wow.
And when people ask you, they may not ask, like I didn't ask out front. He came to me and asked me.
Yeah.
But if you're a leader and you're willing to ask people, what do you want? You're going to find some gems within your sphere that you can develop and sharpen and shine to be able to get into where your space and be productive. And people don't want things just handed to them. Nobody that I know that is a person of color wants anything handed to us. We just want, after we do the hard work, the opportunity to shine.
Yeah. Well, and I what a great example, because that was both personal.
Yeah.
He saw you,
Exactly.
heard your story, asked you the right questions, but then he also had provided a system that allowed you to be able to get the opportunities.
Created the pathway.
Yeah, that's great.
And it was up to me to fail.
Yeah.
or to be successful in
But
it.
to lead, but you had the opportunity.
Yeah. Now, I would have been a fool to not take advantage of that.
Yeah.
That's the other part.
Yeah.
We are culpable to a point for our own futures.
Sure.
And we have to do the things that are necessary. Not always the easy things,
Yeah.
but the things that are necessary to be able to be successful.
I can't. It is crazy to me how fast a half hour goes
I know.
in both these times. It's just fantastic. I thank you again so much for sharing with us. I'd love to give you just so if you were going to share one last thing with anybody who's listening today, and we'll keep going. But
Yeah.
what's today? What would you want to share with everybody?
The biggest thing I want everyone to do today is get out and educate yourselves on our history. Be willing to allow your children to be educated on our history. Learn about people that you know nothing about and grow. Work to grow every single day. That's going to bring us together. That's going to make a huge difference in this world, and it's going to help us change the world we live in right now.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing I can tell people.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Hey, and again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm pretty sure that it was displayed that we've actually recorded this earlier. This isn't live when you're watching it right now. And so maybe some of you did put comments in or questions while you were watching. Just so you know, we didn't address those because we did this before you did that. But I just want to let you know, anything that you did put on there, we will take and receive and put in something that we do in the future. So,
Wonderful.
So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And Shawn, thanks for your time.
Yes, thank you for having me.
All right.